Over the years, Final Fantasy XIV has become more and more streamlined, making jobs simpler and more straightforward. To some degree, making jobs more evenly balanced, even at lower levels, or at the very least made the jobs strong enough that it should hardly matter. Right? However, despite all the streamlining, there are some very odd outliers between jobs where something just serves no purpose, or the optimal rotation becomes insanely cursed and significantly different from the intuitive rotation. Depending on who you ask, these breaks in the system can be considered a good or a bad thing. Either way, let's talk about some of these janky leftovers of Final Fantasy XIV. Subject 1. Weird leveling rotations. For the most part, jobs are designed to be coherent and fully make sense, at the very latest at max level. Most jobs, I'd argue, do make sense at lower levels, and often reach their zenith at a reasonable time, even without having their rotation fully ironed out yet. However, even if their rotations are coherent, sometimes certain level intervals introduce something early or forget to add some other crucial detail, making things really weird very quickly, leading the job down a super cursed rotation. Many players ignore these strange side quests in favor of following whatever is the intuitive rotation. Admittedly, most of the time, these cursed rotations are only slightly stronger than the intuitive path, so I'm not out here going, "Why aren't you playing perfectly?" over something like this. In a leveling situation, no less. However, when most jobs do not have weird, unintuitive, optimal rotations, it makes the ones that do really stand out. Even more so if the janky rotation has stuck around for a long time. Let's take some examples, for which I have 6, which might actually cover all of them. But let's get to it. You can probably prove me wrong there. First, since the AoE MP cost reduction for healers introduced with Endwalker alongside its potency squish, which means December 2021, Scholar's optimal attack rotation for single target before learning Broil is to simply spam Art of War while maintaining their dot on the target. This means that this weird rotation, which genuinely optimizes around getting more auto attacks on a healer, has survived unchanged for about 3.5 years by now. While I do latch on to the AoE MP cost reduction as the timing of this optimization, the reason this jank came about was actually because Ruin 1's potency was reduced from 160 to 150 at the same time. There isn't anything wrong with this kind of jank, but it is funny something like this has stayed around for so long, considering it could be fixed by boosting Ruin 1's potency by like 10. Second example is Summoner, which equally has a weird auto-attack optimization. Even weirder since it came to life as a result of the Endwalker rework itself. Is it deliberate? An oversight? Or what? For Summoner, until they get access to their right spells, Topaz Ruin will always simply match the potency of a regular Ruin spell, which means it is simply an instant version of the spell. For Emerald Ruin 1 and 2, it is slightly better than a regular Ruin, but for Emerald 3, it is similar to Topaz in that it matches regular Ruin in potency per second, assuming you don't have spell speed, of course. However, this does mean that from level 15 to 71, at least one of the summoner's actions are only superior to their regular filler spell if you are in melee range and auto-attacking, or you need the mobility. An additional detail to this oversight is that Ruby Ruin 1, 2, and 3, Topaz Ruin 1, 2, and 3, and Emerald Ruin 1, 2, and 3 are all unique spells in their own right. Same applies for the AoE Outburst and Disaster equivalents. However, none of these spells are present in the summoner's actions and traits, meaning the only way to read their tooltips is to use the Lego piece and then read in the 30 seconds while you have it. Also noting that using the Lego piece probably put you in combat with something, so you also have to fight that. Weird especially since rights and catastrophes do have their tooltips in the actions and traits. Similar to the Scholar case, it isn't that bad that Summoner works like this for so long, but it is rather peculiar it has stayed like this, considering buffing both Topaz runes and Emerald runes by like 10 potency would probably resolve it. Third example is Warrior's Mythril Tempest. When Endwalker changed its effect from extending Surging Tempest to applying it, it made this buff accessible by level 40 instead of level 50. The suggestion is of course that maybe it isn't worth it to apply it in the first place, as the damage loss of using the AoE combo on a single target is too great. However, this is not the case. In fact, looking at just the filler rotation, meaning no Berserk involved, maintaining Surging Tempest is a very tiny damage gain over not doing so, which of course means that it becomes a much greater gain when Berserk is included. A weaker attack that increases the overall damage of the filler would be even more impactful when you spike your highest damage potential even higher. Once again, this kind of jank adds a little spice to the leveling experience for those that find it entertaining, but it could have been resolved by making Mythril Tempest granting Surging Tempest a trait learned at level 50 alongside Storm's Eye. While we're here, why is it Mythril Tempest has to wait until level 74 before generating Beast Gauge? When Dark Knights got their Stalwart Soul moved to level 40, they kept their resource generation. Fourth example is Red Mage's Jolt III. With Dawntrail, Jolt III was randomly added as a new level 84 upgrade to Jolt II. This is fine in its own right. What made things really weird though is that this is the same level that a trait that buffs the Stone and the Fire's potencies is located. And the weird part is that they get buffed to 340 potency while Jolt 3 enters with 360. This is extra strange since Jolt 2 being at 280 potency left plenty of room for Jolt 3 to upgrade from Jolt 2 without overtaking the proc spells and power. In other words, Jolt 3 could have been introduced at 320 or 330 potency and not caused this confusion. It could then be buffed up to 360 at level 94 where the other spells get caught up to speed. The interesting aspect of this jank is that it truly called to the floor the question of how much is 1 mana actually worth? Since in this peculiar level range of 84 to 93, Jolt 3 does 20 more potency than the procs, but the procs generate 1 more mana. It is a very complicated conversation, as exactly how much 1 mana is worth is something we can estimate, but how much you need to sacrifice also matters, since you really care about how many melee combos you can get. In some fights, building extra mana at one point to burst harder at another can also matter. In a way, this jank adds depth to the job in the weirdest way. I actually discussed some of these janky rotations and the math behind them, including this one in this other video, linked in the description, if you want to know how much I estimated 1 mana to be worth at level 90. Fifth example is Monk's Perfect Balance. Originally, Perfect Balance was an excellent way to quickly spin up your Greased Lightning buff, which was a stacking buff with a duration, a rather short one too, and you built it 1 stack at a time each time you used a combo finisher. At some point in Shadowbringers, Greased Lightning was made entirely passive as we see it now, removing this purpose of Perfect Balance. Now, instead, Perfect Balance could be used to back-to-back Dragon Kick and Bootshine. At the time, Dragon Kick's own potency was great enough in its own right that being dropped out of form afterwards wasn't too big of a deal. Then Endwalker introduced Masterful Blitz, but those were learned at level 60, meaning from level 50 to 59, Perfect Balance still had its purpose as the boot kicker, I guess. However, with the Orb rework of Monk in Dawntrail, in the level 50 to 59 range, the 3 combo steps are so insanely close in power to each other that it hardly matters which one you really use. Sure, 1 is slightly stronger when all things are considered, but it is by so little that if it comes at the cost of 1 GZD without form, then it simply isn't worth it, making Perfect Balance mostly a detrimental button until Masterful Blitz is learned. This one I would definitely call an oversight, but one solution would be to have Perfect Balance itself grant Formless Fist when it ends, rather than have that be granted by the Masterful Blitz. And finally the 6th example, which is one I was made aware of super recently by one comment on my Black Mage guide, and is more a testament to the insanity that is Black Mage. Before Firestarter is learned at level 42, but while you still have Fire 3 and Blizzard 3, so level 35 to 41, you can gain 1% filler DPS by instead casting Fire 3 twice in your Astral Fire state, and finish with 1 Fire 1, instead of just spamming Fire once. This is while considering cast attacks. It is worth mentioning that it assumes Thunder is maintained separately, so in the overall total damage it would be slightly less than 1%. What I find even more humorous about this is that before the recent Black Mage changes for 7.2, this would still have been a 0.6% filler DPS gain. Why less and not more? Well, both Blizzard 3 and Fire 3 got a 10 potency boost in 7.2 apparently. Arguably, this rotation comes with its own caveats of spending percentage-wise more time in ice, which can be undesirable due to how it can affect your actual damage based on when a fight ends. Another caveat is that the casts are really long, so you are more likely to be interrupted. And the damage gain is so minuscule that hesitating for even a fraction of a second makes it no longer worth it. If this rotation was seen as a problem, buffing Blizzard 1 and Fire 1 by a measly 5 potency would make it no longer better, and would only affect Black Mage below level 60 in terms of balance. Now, those are the main examples of janky rotations that spring to mind for me, as well as a suggested fix that would make them no longer exist. Do I want them to no longer exist? No, I think they're very harmless and quite funny. Some of them even allow a player to really understand what matters in a job's rotation by seeing this kind of jank pop up, like the Jolt example. However, when most jobs don't have this kind of jank, it does seem like a mistake rather than even remotely intentional. Which leads us on to subject 2. Weird, useless, or pointless actions. Here I have 4 examples. Let's start with the weirdest one. Machinist's Air Anchor stands out in a very odd way in the Machinist's toolkit. Just between their multi-tool actions, one has a single target and AoE option, and charges, but generates no battery. One is both, has a follow-up, and both of those generate battery. And then Air Anchor is not AoE, but generates battery, meaning it becomes an actual decision whether you want the most AoE damage or you want battery. Admittedly, this draws even more attention to the extremely hilarious situation as of patch 7.25 that Blazing Shot beats out a crossbow on 7 targets thanks to the checks, meaning Machinist effectively runs a pseudo single target rotation in most reasonable pull sizes. I will say the solutions, quote unquote, to make Air Anchor not as weird should be obvious, AoE alternative or AoE component, but I do think it adds something interesting to the rotation as it is. Example 2, also weird, but a situational button. Reprise. Initially, in addition to being an emergency movement tool, in Shadowbringers, as red mages needed 80 mana to melee combo rather than 50, Reprise was a solid way to micro-adjust your mana, as spells produced comparatively more mana back then as to now. Which is to say, when the melee combo went from costing 80 down to 50, most spells also lost 3/8 of their mana generation, except the AoE fast spells for whatever reason, which is why they generate so much. Now, an interesting thing about Reprise is that when Endwalker hit and reduced the cost of a melee combo, Reprise had its GCD increased from 2.2 to 2.5. A nerf, essentially. While its potency was adjusted to make it somewhat even with filler spells still, the fact its mana cost is unchanged means that, relative to Shadowbringer's days, Reprise is much more expensive. The fact that red mages generate just about enough mana for 3 melee combos per 2 minutes, including modification, with only a bit to spare, also means that rarely are there mana in reserve to use on Reprise. And even if there was, why would you? Now, I think Reprise perfectly fulfills the niche it needs to. It works as a finisher for fights in cases where there is time for genuinely only one last spell before the fight ends. It works as an emergency spell if you have nothing else while needing to move. I do think though that Reprise easily could cost 4 or even 3 mana without it negatively affecting balance. But what do you think? Example 3, a somewhat pointless button. Scathe. Something absolutely incredible about this action is viewing its patch notes. Added in 2.0, in 2.1 it was nerfed from 120 to 100 potency. And aside from that, only its MP cost was normalized with Shadowbringers. This is actually an ARR spell, as is. Something really funny happened right at the launch of Dawntrail, as the rework of how Thunder works meant you could only cast Thunder with a Thunderhead buff, which, at the fastest, you could produce 1 of every second GCD, either with spells or through transpose. Why does that matter? Well, Thunder 1 started with an initial potency of 120. Scathe's average potency is 120, which meant that Thunder 1 was objectively superior to Scathe in every way and was learned earlier. Very quickly, Thunder 1 and its upgrades got some small upfront potency nerfs, which quote-unquote resolved this. I can't imagine it had to do with Scathe, but it was pretty interesting how specific it was. However, with the faster cast times Black Mage now has, combined with the fact Thunder is more effective to set up in a run-and-gun situation, means that Scathe has an extremely short list of use cases, and most of them either stop being relevant at a certain level or can be circumvented with other options. In the level range where Scathe is the most helpful, Pictomancer straight up has nothing to compare, aside from smudging ahead to get time for a spell cast. And Red Mage at best can stab something with their weapon skills to do non-zero damage. In a way, this gives Black Mage a very weird advantage. Some common suggestions about Scathe is to either remove it or rework it, or even some have suggested having it upgrade into some of the polyglot actions, since by the time you get those, you would probably never need Scathe anyway. A suggestion I personally like is making Scathe's potency build as you cast other things, up to a cap of course, as some sort of slow build burst button, but I can also already see the problems with that. But what do you think? And finally, example 4. Cure 1, Benefic 1, Physick, and Diagnosis. Similar to Scathe, all 4 of these spells have niche uses in a certain level range, and then completely drop off in usefulness and basically never recover. In a way, they are a relic of a past era of the game, where MP management was or is more important. At lower levels, this can still be significant in very, very specific circumstances, which effectively means that removing them could be a problem. Having them automatically upgrade into their superior counterparts also doesn't always work, because these niche situations cover level range beyond that, meaning that upgrading them at level 30 could pose a problem, but upgrading at, say, level 60 might not. But that would be really strange, wouldn't it? The problem, in a way, is that the way certain jobs function are almost 2 different worlds indicated by 2 different level ranges, and ultimately what could truly fix it all would probably be re-evaluating how these jobs work in general, so that they don't change as much as you level up. A bit like the classic Black Mage's rotation changes every 10 levels thing people like to say. Maybe it isn't a great idea that healers completely transform how they play about halfway through the leveling experience. But what do you think? Do you feel like I overlooked a ton of janky rotations and buttons in Final Fantasy XIV? Or are you maybe a bit surprised by the suggestion that most jobs work pretty intuitively for most of the leveling experience? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally Monk's Tornado Kick consumed the fully maxed Greased Lightning effect for massive damage, making it an excellent finisher, like Six-Sided Star is now. Or led to a problem where you needed to quickly stack up again. When Greased Lightning was made fully passive, Tornado Kick was actually an OGCD cooldown attack until Endwalker.